Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Craig Turner. I'm the president of World Trade Center, Buffalo, Niagara. We appreciate you spending some time with us this afternoon on a topic that is pretty important to our region. I think one of our panelists is straggling, but we're gonna get going to make sure we use the time wisely here. We've been, World Trade Center, Buffalo, Niagara, and our region. We've been watching the border very closely. Very interestingly, we talked to some of our partner World Trade Centers around both countries, the U.S. and Canada. And it seems the further you get away from the border, obviously, the less it becomes a specific topic of focus. So we've been talking with them and keeping them in the know on conversations that we've been having here locally. Some of the work we've been doing, we're going to talk about today. We see, the effects of the border every day. It's very real for us. We've got a great group of panelists today to discuss it and kind of break down, what's been happening and what we're noticing in a few different arenas that we cover here. Very pleased to have with us Jill Apa, who's an immigration attorney with Hodgson Russ. Hodgson Russ also our main sponsor for the event, so we appreciate that, Jill. Don Sear is the head of the Niagara Industrial Association. I haven't seen him pop on yet, but he'll be here shortly. Dr. Kathryn Friedman is the Global Fellow with Woodrow Wilson Center, and she's also with the University of Buffalo, and she is the co-chair of the Binational Prosperity Initiative, which is a collaborative effort that we'll talk about a little bit. And Ron Rienas is general manager of the Buffalo and Fort Erie Public Bridge Authority, who probably sees the effects of having the border closed due to the COVID-19 shutdown more closely than anyone. Our goal for today is not really to speculate, because things keep changing around us every day on just about every topic we deal with, but to talk about the current facts, the current situation, the current sentiments and trends, in an effort to help everyone on this call and people who listen to it on the recorded end afterwards, make smarter decisions, make better decisions, and more informed decisions. I want to thank our sponsors, this is particularly important to us because last week would have been World Trade Celebration, which many of you attend every year, and is our big fundraiser for the year at World Trade Center Buffalo, Niagara. And like any other business organization, we had to pivot, and we moved into a different format to get this information out. We appreciate that our sponsors came from the live event with us over here. So thank you to Hodgson Russ, to CanAm, to the Consulate General of Canada in New York, Niagara County Center for Economic Development, Rich Products, and Speed Global Services for supporting this webinar series, which there will be 2 more sessions in July, which we'll talk about towards the end. As far as quick housekeeping, we would normally talk about snacks and bathrooms and things now, but it's a new world. So most importantly, if you have questions, we want to get to them while the topics are on the table. We're not going to hold and do a Q&A at the end. If something comes up during the discussion that you want to ask a question about, go ahead and type it in the chat window, and we'll be paying attention and work the questions right into the discussion. So with that, thank you again for being here. I'm looking forward to a great discussion today. We're going to start just by having our panelists, and maybe Jill, we could start with you. Just give us a 90-second introduction on why you're here and what we're going to talk about today. So I appreciate it.
Sure. I'm here, I think because I know what I'm talking about when it comes to immigration. Sometimes I question that. I'm an immigration attorney with Hodgson Russ, and obviously the COVID-19 crisis and the travel bans at the border have really impacted how Canadian citizens can come into the United States, perform trade, build their businesses, all that kind of good stuff is kind of halted. So that's what we're going to talk about today in terms of restrictions, what you still can do, what you can't do, opinions at the border, and all that kind of good stuff.
Thanks, Jill. Kate?
Hi, can you hear me? Okay,
yep.
Okay, great. So as you suggested in your introduction, I research Canada-U.S. issues and have focused on border and border policy, border law and policy issues, over the past 10 or 15 years. I am currently working with stakeholders, talking to folks down in Washington and Ottawa and local stakeholders as well, trying to figure out a path forward, how to minimize risk and actually think about what the border reopening should look like and will look like whenever that happens. So I operate more at the policy, maybe 20,000 foot level, but like to think I have at least 1 foot planted in the real world.
Thanks, Kate. Ron?
Yes, I'm Ron Rienas, the General Manager of the Buffalo and Fort Erie Public Bridge Authority. So not only do we operate the Peace Bridge and everything that surrounds moving traffic, we are also the landlord for CBP and for Canada Border Services Agency, CBSA, as well as the landlord for Duty Free Americas and Peace Bridge Duty Free in Canada. So while we continue to be open as an essential service for both countries, we're mandated to be open. We continue to provide all the services that CBSA and CBP require to continue to operate. So we're required to do that by mandate of the government. Unfortunately, as a result of the border restrictions, 95% of our automotive traffic has disappeared. It's not just us, all the border crossings. And since the imposition of the restrictions on March 21st, our truck traffic is down about 21%, although that's been improving over the last few weeks as the economies begin to reopen. So as the discussion goes on, we'll talk a little bit more about those impacts, but clearly it's having a tremendous negative effect on our operations. And as you all know, we're self-funded, so having a big impact on our revenues.
Thanks, Ron. I want to mention one thing, just if you're looking at your list of participants, Matt Glynn from the Buffalo News is on, and we really appreciate him jumping into the conversation and hopefully get some coverage out of it, because it's important to all of us. But I wanted you to know the Buffalo News is in the room as you type questions in the chat box. Thank you for those introductions. We appreciate it, and we'll keep an eye out for Don when he pops in. Kate, maybe I can start with you. We're all seeing the current situation at the border from different perspectives. Can you talk about what you're seeing as some of the challenges right now and what it's caused for? And you would look at the economic piece, the bigger picture. What are you spending your days working on relative to the border?
Well, so I think the conversation, has really shifted over the last several months since the joint action was declared, back in March or April. Initially, I think that people were concerned that we would experience a real decline in trade across the Canada-U.S. border. But when Canada and the United States restricted travel across the border to essential travel, essential commerce, that obviously includes trade. There may have been a few hiccups early on with regard to supply chains that I heard about, through different business associations. But for the most part, I've heard that trade has continued, pretty much uninterrupted. The conversation is shifting now to the impact of the border restrictions on more localized stakeholders, on the local economy, on the tourism industry locally, which, as we all know, has been decimated. And really, we haven't heard anything from either the Canadian government or the U.S. administration about what the border is going to look like when it opens back up. But people are starting to think about that and think about what sort of health screening measures would have to be in place. until a vaccine is found. And so the conversation has shifted a little bit, and so I'm thinking more about some of those local issues.
Ron, where is the PBA's focus been the past 8-10 weeks or so?
Our focus has been on continuing to provide a safe environment for both CBSA and CBP to continue to operate. We've been actually very fortunate that there have been no cases of COVID within our own Peace Bridge Authority staff and no cases at CBSA. I believe we've had 2 cases spread out over the last couple of months or 3 months within CBP. But those issues have been dealt with very quickly in accordance with all the CDC guidelines. So we have really ramped up we've probably tripled our sanitation of our facilities, cleaning, disinfecting, doing all of the things that are required to be done to continue to keep the border open. Because if we get to a situation that has been seen in industrial environments where we would have to close down either CBSA or CBP, it doesn't have to be both. It just takes one to actually shut down the border to all traffic, and that would include essential traffic as well. So that's been our focus, is to continue to operate in a safe and efficient manner for CBSA and CBP.
Jill, I waited for you for last on this one. Because it's probably a little more detailed as far as what you're dealing with on a daily basis on the immigration side. What have you been focused on?
Well, so my answer to that question would have been a lot different a couple days ago because there's a brand new presidential proclamation that came out last night that targets H-1B visas, H-2Bs, and L1s. So what we're really focused on in terms of, being border practitioners is whether or not, and we have a lot of, the L1 is a category, an immigration category that allows for an intra-company transfer. So you have an operating company in Canada, you have an operating company in the United States, and the L1 allows for the transfer of either managers or executives or employees of specialized knowledge. So the L1 is a universal immigration category, but it's one that is used a lot by our Canadian clients, particularly for people who are not actually moving to the United States, but they're coming on an as-needed basis as a manager, executive, or specialized knowledge employee. And this presidential proclamation is unclear as to whether or not that applies to Canadians. The language of it states that there's people that it basically bans the admission of a person who wants to enter the United States pursuant to a visa. Canadian citizens, for the most part, are visa exempt, particularly when it comes to L1s. So we're trying to figure out, and we're trying to get some more guidance from Customs and Border Protection as to whether or not this applies to Canadians, or whether really the use of the word visa means our Canadian clients can continue to come over. So that's really what we've been focused on for the last 24 hours or a little less. Prior to that, it was more of, could our Canadian clients come in? You had to prove that, as Kathryn said, you had to prove you were essential. So that was something that was becoming, an issue with our Canadian clients. How do we do it? What documentation do we need to show that? And then going back to Canada, are you subject to the 14-day quarantine? So that's really what we've been focusing on quite a bit, is how to get people over, how to get them over safely, and what are the ramifications of coming over.
One of the things that's driving, well, actually, I'm going to ask the question about how much it's driving policy is sentiment. You follow social media, you see that there's a pretty good split between people that feel comfortable getting back to normal and people who say we should still be as cautious as possible. this comes out in policy. And Ron, maybe you're the best to at least take a first whack at this. Is you know, one of the things that stood out was resolutions by some of the towns in the Niagara region saying keep the border closed, and you know, which is stopping people from getting to cottages and things like that. How much is the sentiment, and I know it's also about people come from Toronto coming down to the Niagara region too, as part of the concern there. How much is the sentiment resonating in Ottawa and Washington as we look at these dates being extended, you know, into the summer?
Well, I think it's a little bit different. The Canadian rules, and that's part of the confusing part. The Canadian rules are clearly much stricter than the U.S. rules, and it happens at the border as well. For example, you can fly to the U.S. Without any challenges, realistically, from anywhere that a plane will fly in Canada. But if you come back to Canada, there's a 14-day quarantine period. That is not the case if you fly into the U.S. At the land border, it's closed basically in both directions. U.S. Customs will return people to Canada. Canada will return people to the U.S. But there's also some confusion even with that. When you see essential travel, and essential could be anything from logistics folks, truckers, healthcare workers, students. For example, all Peace Bridge Authority staff can move back and forth across the border. Family members can now move back and forth back into Canada from the U.S., but they must still quarantine, which means essentially it still remains closed even if there's a family member. And it's very challenging, particularly at the Peace Bridge. We see a lot of seasonal residents, and those seasonal residents have homes in Canada. They're basically summer homes, and they commute back and forth across the border every day. No different than, for example, a student going to school or a nurse going to a hospital in Buffalo. But because they happen to be American or not essential, they cannot go to their summer home and travel back and forth, even if they were to agree that it would only be them and not have weekend parties and all of those. There is a very strict prohibition on that. So for example, even in talking with local elected officials, a lot of them feel that, you know, they're a big part. They pay taxes. There should be some sort of carve out for those types of people to be able to cross back and forth realistically. And the other thing that I've said before, with a lot of operations still closed, when I'm talking about operations, I'm talking about large crowd-inducing operations like baseball games or hockey games. None of that is happening. So even if the border were to reopen tomorrow and allow travel back and forth, we would see nowhere near the traffic that we would traditionally see on a summer day, because there's no reason to travel back and forth across the border if there's no attractors that are open, like if Marina is closed, if the Blue Jays are closed, the exhibition is closed, the county fair is closed. All of those attractors remain closed. So the amount of traffic that would actually cross would be significantly less than we traditionally see. So my perspective is that both governments should look at it more from a risk perspective as opposed to having a blanket prohibition, particularly as we're now moving into the fourth month of the restrictions that are in place.
Kate, do you want to weigh in on the sentiment at all?
Well, I think as my colleagues have already mentioned, there really is an alignment between Canada and the United States on the issue, which makes any sort of solution very challenging.
Jill, on back to the immigration side, every person, every worker that's going to need to cross the border is going to have individualized situation. So it's hard to have a forum like this and get into the weeds on guidance. But what are the questions? What are the questions that people should be asking as they consider their options for crossing the border or not crossing the border, or kind of preparing for when there's going to be, because I don't think anybody envisions it's going to be one day it's going to be open, but there's going to be stages of opening? What should people be preparing for?
Well, so there's different categories of work permits for U.S. immigration, and just different immigration categories. The things that we've seen are, the TN, which is authorized under the NAFTA. That's a work permit. That one has not been touched by the new presidential proclamation, and they are still processing those applications at the Peace Bridge. They're also processing them at the pre-flight clearance stations at the airports. So if you go to a land border, you have to prove that the role is essential. If you fly in and apply for the TN at the airport, you apparently don't have to do that. But the airports sometimes are a little bit more strict on work permits. So that one is you can get in with that one. If you're thinking about, investing in the United States, or trying to parlay the fact that you are Canadian business and you do trade with the United States, if you're trying to talk about an E1 or an E2 visa, those have not been touched by the new presidential proclamation. And same thing, if you fly in, you don't have to prove that your presence in the United States is essential. However, the U.S. consulates all around the globe are not processing visa applications at this point in time, and we don't know when they're going to start doing that again. So that's something you should ask in terms of, even if I could do it, practically speaking, is there something blocking me? And for the E, that means you can submit the application to the consulate, but you're not going to get a visa. And that means you can't get in. The L1 are, up until yesterday, they were still being processed. That's the intercompany transfer. So the questions now are, is the L1 impacted by this new presidential proclamation? What are the restrictions on Canadians? And that's going to really, for business owners or for people who want to expand their business into the United States, those are really important questions, because, this proclamation is valid until at least December 31st of 2020 and could be extended. So it's not just a matter of, well, they're going to stop things for the next 30 to 60 days and put a pause on it, and people could probably live with that. But once you're talking about 6 months and then opportunity for extension, that becomes where more questions have to come into play as to how am I going to get business either up and running, or how am I going to keep my business going? There are some exceptions in this proclamation, but it's too new to really even speak to those and how we would even apply for that.
So questions, continued questions for a while.
Continued questions. I mean, it's pretty much as clear as mud at this point, because I can say too with students, I know, the Peace Bridge, I know that the guidance had said, okay, students can come in if they're going to an American university. And I know that the policy at the Peace Bridge, however, was if your school is closed and your school is only doing virtual learning, they were regularly returning students back to Canada. So, then it becomes, do I fly? How do I get in? Can I go home? Those are all kinds of things that, are just really up in the air, and really makes for a very unsettling type of situation for, for most foreign nationals that want to come to the United States.
So have a good immigration attorney.
Yeah. Yeah, and even then, it's like they play hide the ball with us on a regular basis. You think you have things down, and now we know how things are going, and then all of a sudden it's kind of like Charlie Brown trying to kick the ball.
Yeah. Ron, let me jump to your operation. So as we mentioned earlier that passenger traffic is almost entirely down. Freight traffic is down, but it's still flowing. But your operations are still full steam ahead, even though your revenues are a fraction of what they were before. How are you addressing that, and how are you thinking about long-term planning?
Well, as you said, we're fortunate that we still have the commercial traffic flowing, and commercial tolls, as you all know, are more important than the car tolls. They're obviously much higher. But I mean, the board of the Peace Bridge has ongoing discussions related to how we continue to operate. The board will be considering budget reductions, particularly as it relates to capital, at least deferring some projects to future out years to preserve our financial position. I guess it's no different than many other businesses. All the businesses that I know of are undertaking similar steps, and we're no different. However, unlike other businesses, we are not eligible for a lot of the government programs in both Canada and the United States. So that does create some challenges, but we will weather the storm and we'll come out of it okay. But it certainly does have an impact on our operations.
Kate, I want to get to the Binational Prosperity Initiative, but I'm going to do a quick plug first. We did launch yesterday an episode of the WTCBN podcast with Kate, and it was a great interview. It's a little more specific to the initiative probably than we're going to get into today, but definitely if you listen to podcasts on Google Play or iTunes, step over there and listen to that. It was a great interview about the border. But recently under the leadership of the Binational Prosperity Initiative, a group of agencies collaborated to create a letter that we sent to federal, state, local officials on both sides of the border with recommendations for reopening the border after the shutdown. We didn't say open the border tomorrow, but as you discuss opening the border, here are some things you need to think of from the very feet on the ground level. Can you walk us through some of those recommendations and why this was such an important exercise?
Oh, well, sure. So as you just suggested, and I think it was early May, time sure flies. We held a workshop and we convened leadership from industry associations, economic development agencies, the public sector, border operators, companies engaged in cross-border commerce, and some other folks to discuss smart strategies for reopening the Canada-U.S. border. And it was getting folks on the ground who are entrenched in these issues on a daily basis to provide insights and thoughts that we would send on up to state and provincial and federal officials and policymakers with regard to opening up the border in a smart and responsible way. So we came up with a number of recommendations, 7 or 8 in all. And so for example, it's been mentioned several times on this webinar, but as in most recently by Ron, the border operators, the Peace Bridge Authority and the Niagara Falls Bridge Commission, we recommended that they receive some sort of federal or state or provincial assistance in order to maintain operations, because their toll revenues have declined dramatically because of the downtick in car volumes and bus traffic, but they are still required to remain fully operational. So we recommended that policymakers designate some sort of funding, stimulus funding or however they want to package it, for border operators so that critical commerce and security operations continued without interruption. We also recommended that Canada and the United States expand the marketing of Nexus as one solution to touchless processing at the border. I mean, when you think about it, the Nexus program is, an ideal in terms of touchless processing. But as importantly, we recommended that leadership from DHS and New York State negotiate some sort of resolution to the current prohibition of processing Nexus applications for New York State residents on the part of DHS. So we think that getting over that hurdle is important, because Nexus does represent one piece of a solution to crossing the border once it opens. Relatedly, we recommended that Canada and the United States invest in border technology to ensure that border crossers are healthy. So again, it gets to this point that I made earlier. There is now some attention and some focus on health screening at the border. I am aware of, and Ron, you may have other information. I am aware of concepts in the airport setting for using technology to ensure that travelers are healthy and COVID-free once the border reopens. I'm not aware of any concrete concepts in the land crossing context, but again, you may be aware of some of those conversations. One of the challenges is to take that from concept to market. It generally takes a pretty long time. So people really need to be thinking about health screening now and coming up with the concepts and getting the funding and doing the tests or the pilots to put them in place relatively quickly. Stakeholders also recommended that, just generally speaking, implementing USMCA entering into force on July 1st is really important for the economic recovery of both nations, and that seems to be the case. So stakeholders, I'm sure, are pleased about that. Some of the higher level policy recommendations included incorporating a Buy American or Buy Canadian provision into the next rounds of stimulus funding, if we do indeed see further rounds of stimulus funding. A Canadian exemption into Buy American legislation and vice versa on the Canadian side is really important because we all know that protectionist sentiments rear their ugly heads during difficult economic times, but these provisions actually end up hurting competition and jobs and businesses in both countries. We thought, and I think there is still something to this, that when the governments decide to reopen the border, there has to be some element for local or cross-border regional discretion, meaning a one-size-fits-all approach. I just don't know how that's going to work. The flip side, because each region is different. Each cross-border region is different, and they're set up differently. Again, Ken and Ron can talk to the ways that they operate, but each border operator operates differently and has different relationships with CBSA and CBP across the border. So there has to be some sort of local discretion to cross-border stakeholders, recognizing obviously that the border is under federal authority. So trying to figure out what that right mix is going to be a challenge, but it was recommended that a one-size-fits-all approach probably should not be undertaken, that there should be some discretion given to other folks. So, now we are thinking about hosting another roundtable that focuses strictly on the health screening issue, because that is going to be key, and policymakers are going to be very interested in ideas when the border does reopen to all traffic.
Let me segue that. Thank you, Kate. Let me segue that into, crisis creates opportunity, and one of the interesting things about the whole shutdown has been the creativity that has been spread through all industries. So when it comes to the border, and Jill, I'll give you a pass on this question unless you want to answer it, because I know you got thrown for a loop just recently. But Kate and Ron, and Jill, if you want to answer, what are you seeing coming out of this? Where are there best practices and better ways of doing business going forward that we might not have thought of unless we were forced to think of them?
Maybe I'll start with an anecdotal story, which some may find very interesting. So in terms of people trying to be creative, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So we had a request for a wedding, a socially distant wedding on the Peace Bridge at the flags. The groom was from Buffalo. The bride was an essential worker from Fort Erie who crossed back and forth all the time. They're going to have a socially distant wedding at the flags. American guests, 7 of them, would walk up from the U.S. side. 8 Canadian guests would walk up from the Canadian side. They would stay on each side of the border. They would get married right at the flags because they couldn't do it in either country. And because she's an essential worker, she can go back and forth every day anyway. So we thought it was a great idea. We certainly at the Peace Bridge were prepared to support that happening. CBP thought it was fine with them. Unfortunately, CBSA said no, because they've had lots of these requests along the entire border to do these types of things. So we thought it was creative, but the governments didn't think it was so creative. So that's my answer. You have lots of creative ideas. You need the government to support some of them.
And Don popped on. Don Sear with the Niagara Industrial Association. How are you, Don?
Very good. Sorry, Craig, for being late. I was having trouble with connections.
No worries, no worries. Kate, what are you seeing as opportunity going forward?
Well, so I just want to piggyback on something that Ron said and put a point on what he said about government needing to be responsive. I had a conversation within the last week with some fairly senior level folks who are engaged on this issue. And by all accounts, there is very little, I'm trying to be diplomatic, very little movement or engagement on the part of some of the key agencies who have authority over the border to really start thinking more proactively about creatively resolving these problems. The fear is that, how is that for, the fear is that, the border is just going to reopen and without much thought put into it, meaning folks really aren't listening to our recommendations, and it is going to be a little challenging for folks trying to cross and for the border operators. So Ron's point about government needing to listen, I think is well taken. Well, in terms of opportunities, we have been working with cross-border stakeholders on both sides of the border here in this region and also in Detroit, Windsor over the past several years to really create regional capacity to deal with exactly these sorts of issues, as opposed to reacting all of the time to what governments on both sides of the border sort of decree. There has been this sentiment for a long time, and I say this all the time, long before I came on the scene and long after I leave, there will be, there's this sentiment that we need cross-border regional capacity in order to proactively address many of these, very significant issues that have an economic impact on industry and on jobs. Folks do see this current border, quote unquote, crisis as the opportunity to push that argument ahead to the key funders, to really start investing. And I think the argument is now is time to invest in cross-border regional capacity building in both Detroit, Windsor, and in Buffalo, Niagara, because, we have demonstrated, a very small slice, increased job opportunities and economic output if we aligned in certain key areas with regard to economic policy. That those data are real. That those prospects are real. This is not any longer a theoretical academic conversation. We need to get funding to build that capacity and move that vision, which quite frankly is not my vision. It's the vision of everybody who's been involved in this effort over the last 4 or 5 years. I just had a platform to help convene those voices to move the ball ahead. Folks just think that now's the time to do that. So there is opportunity and there is movement in that regard.
Thanks, Kate. Joe, before I go over to Don, is there anything in your world that you're seeing as an opportunity to do for the border to do things better?
No, I mean, I can just say that there's always opportunity to be creative and to get creative with the sort of limited work permits that we have. There's a lot of wiggle room in the law, and for people who want to get jobs in the United States or invest in the United States or conduct trade with the United States, there's lots of opportunity and there's lots of ways to get creative. What's tying the hands right now is just the flat out ban on admission. So, that's kind of the takeaway, is if we can get you here, there's lots of opportunity, there's lots of things to talk about. But right now it's kind of, we have a collision between the health crisis as well as sort of the policies coming out of Washington that are, not altogether immigrant friendly right now. So that together kind of creates a perfect storm of, in my brain, I can be real creative, but how can I implement that? And that's the tough part.
Thanks, Joe. Don, we talked a little bit about sentiment, and this is I wanted to get your thoughts on this, because you're working with the manufacturers, but you're also seeing the the response from the local community on the Canadian side, and the way the policy is being driven by the sentiment about border crossing a little bit at this point. The question that was that we discussed was, how much is that local sentiment affecting decision making in Ottawa, or is it just kind of affecting the overall picture here in our binational region, from your perspective?
Yeah, it's difficult to say. You're speaking to the issue of non-essential travel.
Right.
From the manufacturer side, I would say that our members have not noticed a difference in terms of their operations and the border at this point in time. Certainly those, on the manufacturing side, things seem to be going quite well. They're not experiencing any supply chain issues that they're experiencing are not related to the border. Non-essential travel restrictions anecdotally affect some in an indirect way. So in terms of, let's say, machine shop operations that might have contracts for some tourism related operations and aspects, and of course they're affected indirectly from the slowdown in the tourism industry on that side. I think if you're talking about the non-essential travel, I think recent poll in Canada did not have much support for opening the border for non-essential travel at this time. So I think from a federal perspective, that is driving issues. Then within the Niagara region, I suspect it's mixed, but I think one of the things that certainly was of concern as we moved to what we call stage 3 in the Niagara region, which then allowed individuals that were in stage 2 in the Toronto area to come into Niagara. That's of concern, as would be the allowance of non-essential travel at the Canada-U.S. border. One of the things that is interesting to note is that demographically, the Niagara region is the 3rd oldest region in Canada. If there's an area in Quebec, Kelowna out in British Columbia, and then the Niagara region is, 3rd oldest region. So that is of concern, as there doesn't there doesn't appear to be much change in the findings that older individuals may be more susceptible to stronger symptoms due to the COVID-19. So that I would note anecdotally appears to be a bit of concern on many individuals' minds regionally. There was a Niagara region economic or state of affairs last week, and so our medical officer in the region, that was a point made in there as well. So yeah.
Thanks, Dan. There's a question in the chat about the July 21st deadline. I don't want anybody to speculate, because I don't think anybody knows what's going to happen until the days leading up. But can we discuss that deadline a little bit, and what 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 we expect to see over the next several weeks?
As Kathryn noted, we're not the individuals that actually control those dates. I suspect that what is going to be watched closely is to see if there is let's call it a pseudo second wave, and that is the Niagara region, in particular with respect to opening up to the greater Toronto area, and also what will happen in terms of the United States and the pandemic. As you know, although New York State, as a whole, has done quite well, when you look at the larger picture, of course, that the curve has not, as they call it, has not quite flattened in the same way as some other countries, and so that will definitely be something that'll be watched for.
Ron, do you have any thoughts on the deadline at this point?
I think it depends almost entirely as to what happens in the United States. And the sentiment in Canada, at least based on opinion polls, is that there's overwhelming support to keep the border closed, and ultimately that's what Ottawa is going to respond to, is what's happening in the U.S. If it's deemed to be not under control in the U.S., I suspect that it will extend beyond July 21st.
I agree. I think, as you noted, Craig, anything at this point would be speculation, but I would not be surprised if the border remained closed for another month and through August.
Let me, we're coming up on 3 o'clock here, and we want to be respectful of everyone's time. I'd like to just ask one last question, which is and from each of your perspectives, a takeaway. What's the, either what are you going to be following most closely, or what should our participants and our businesses and our stakeholders be following most closely? Whoever wants to go first. Maybe Katie, maybe you go first, because you're the stage setter.
Well, truly, I think it is trying to carve out more exceptions to the non-essential travel category, as the Trudeau government did with allowing family members over. But again, as long as people still need to quarantine when they go to for 14 days into Canada, that's a little problematic. But I think that at least from an individual standpoint, folks who do have properties, cottages over in Southern Ontario, if they can continue to push those levers, advocate, to their congressional representatives, for some sort of exception, I think, that's clearly one thing that they can continue to do. Whether or not they will be successful remains to be seen. And I think the next big issue is really going to be health screening.
Jill, that is a loaded question for you.
Well, I think, immigration is always kind of a pendulum, and it typically swings, you know, either way. And right now we're swinging in sort of a restrictive type of mode because of, like I said, the collision between policy coming out of Washington and just this terrible health crisis that we have going on. But, you know, I think the takeaway is that people are always going to want to come to the United States, and people are always going to want to, you know, we're going to want to, you know, trade and business and trade between the United States and Canada is always going to be a good thing. So at some point, the pendulum is going to swing the other way, and there won't be so many restrictions, and there won't be so many, you know, things that we have to strategize around. But, you know, I would just kind of keep that in mind, that I think a lot of everything that's going on is temporary. And we will go back to sort of the trade heyday that I think, you know, like I said, is always a good thing between the United States and Canada.
Thanks, Jill. Ron, what are you focused on for the next?
Yeah, well, I'd like to see the border open on July 21st with a much greater emphasis on using technology at the border to deal with some of the health and safety issues. For example, manufacturing environments are using temperature screenings every time an employee comes into the plant. There's no reason why that could not be done at a border. Yes, the processing time would take longer, but given the very low volumes that are in place, there's not exactly going to be lineups on the bridge, particularly when the major attractors on either side of the country are not open in terms of sporting events and major events like that. So, you know, having a greater emphasis on technology, surely the New York State and the federal government could use this time to sort out their nexus differences and really promote the Nexus program as a no-touch way of crossing the border. Having some flexibility for seasonal residents, even if it means showing proof of residence that you own a residence in Niagara for our American friends to come across the Peace Bridge and enjoy at least part of the summer at their summer residence. So those are the three things that I would focus on for now, with the view of having the border reopen on July 21st.
Thanks, Ron. Don, I see you're muted. I want to give you the last word here on, you know, oh, you're back. You know, from your perspective, from the NIA's perspective, what are you watching? What's your biggest takeaway here leading up to the 21st?
Well, just from a broader issue, I think definitely now as the summer progresses, you're going to see that the impact on the tourism industry, which is, as I said, noted, indirectly affects some of our members. That's going to be, you know, an issue that people are going to be looking at. And indeed, there has been some movement around supports for the greater supports federally for the tourism industry going over here in the summer. I agree with Ron that this is a perfect time to look at updates in technology with respect to the border, both with, you know, in terms of brokerage, etc. There's a lot of things that could be done, and you know, this is a good time to do them.
Good. Well, thank you. Yeah, like Kate, I've been advocating on cross-border things for a long time, and it's always an interesting situation. Kate, you talked about the you know, the cottagers continuing to advocate. It's always an interesting situation when you are advocating the government in another country to do something that's going to benefit you, because you're not a stakeholder, you're not a taxpayer. They're going to go to their own stakeholders and taxpayers first. So at what point, as Gay put in the question there, at what point does the economy and, you know, businesses suffering and even closing having a specific effect on that? So thank you to all of you for offering your insights today. Thanks to everybody for participating in the webinar. We appreciate it. Again, we're this new normal of how to deliver content. I'm pleased with how it's playing out, because I think both of our webinars so far have been great. Our next one is July 14th at 2 o'clock. It's on supply chain. We got a great panel for that one too, talking about just what companies are doing to pivot. Everybody's using that word pivot to change and you know, make plans for the future. So Jill, Kate, Ron, Don, thank you so much. Thank you to our sponsors for the series again, Hodgson, Calamar, the Consulate General of Canada in New York, Niagara County Center for Economic Development, Rich Products, and Speak Global Services for supporting it, the webinar series, so we can put it on. You will receive a link to the recording if you want to go back and hear anything again, or share it, even better. And thank you again, and then we'll see you on July 14th. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye. Thank you.